In this video lecture, we're going to talk about informal reports. What are they? How do they differ or relate to formal reports? And how can you go about constructing them? In particular, we're going to focus on progress and status reports. So let's talk about how formal and informal reports relate. Formal reports generally focus on large and complex issues with lots of moving parts. Informal reports, on the other hand, are focused on smaller issues. Formal reports are usually quite long. They can range anywhere from 10 pages to, well, why not 10,000 pages? There are such things. These reports can be huge, particularly if done by the federal government. Informal reports, though, are usually fairly short. They're designed to be taken in a single bite, used, and then put aside. Formal reports, though, people keep coming back to year after year. Formal reports follow common and relatively fixed structures. These things are institutionalized not just inside organizations, but they're done worldwide. So, for example, if you're writing something in the sciences, you're going to follow the IMRAD format, Introduction, Methods, Results, and Discussion. Everybody does that. But if you're writing something informal just for the people around you, you can follow whatever format you want to. Now, please note, there are a lot of informal reports that are highly structured, fill-in-the-blank forms, for example, but that's not to say that all informal reports are fill-in-the-blanks. They can take a wide variety of formats. Formal reports are prepared by experts and professionals. These are highly structured, they're slick documents often. This is the sort of thing we're trying to train you to write. Informal reports, though, all sorts of people write these things for all sorts of situations, and they take, again, all sorts of formats. Formal reports are for a wide variety of audiences. You have primary audiences, secondary audiences, tertiary audiences. One person will read the report, pass it along to somebody else, who will pass it along to somebody else. However, an informal report, in contrast, is done for a very narrow audience. Often only one person will ever read it. How do these things function? Formal reports, they do things like making recommendations, they determine feasibility, they provide evaluations. There are other possibilities as well, but these are some of the more common ones. An informal report, on the other hand, is usually doing something like explaining what happened, providing a test result, describing the procedures that were followed, summarizing a laboratory experiment, what did we do, describing the progress or status of a project, and all sorts of other interesting things. So informal reports cover a wider variety of possibilities than formal reports usually do. Let's talk about the formats. Informal reports have all sorts of different formats. For example, memos, letters, emails, oral presentations, PowerPoints, fill-in-the-blank forms, you name it. There's all sorts of possibilities. Formal reports, though, one of three major formats you'll see. They're going to be printed and bound documents, websites, or fully functional interactive PDFs. Who prepares these things? We talked about this a little bit, but informal reports can be, and are, created by just about anybody. For example, fake chemistry students, lifeguards, business people. All these people will create informal reports. So the science student, hey, this is a lab report, here's what I did in class. The lifeguard, I applied first aid to so-and-so because. The businessman, I went on a travel trip, well, not necessarily during COVID-19 pandemic, but I went on a travel trip and I talked to these people and these are my business possibilities. So informal reports, all sorts of possibilities, all sorts of people. Even your mom might write these things. Oh, come on. Do you think that I'd actually pass up the chance to make a good your mom joke? But let's talk formal reports. They're usually created by experts and professionals. So somebody who is a professional, such as yours truly, gets paid to write these things. I've done a little bit of freelancing, and not to tootle my own horn too loudly, but I made a couple of $1,000 for some work. I mean, I worked hard on it, but yeah, I made a couple of $1,000 just freelancing, putting together a report for people. So this stuff, it can be really big business. The audiences. As we mentioned already, formal reports have multiple and varied audiences, whereas informal reports have smaller audiences. Think about this. There's a nuclear power plant being built. Who is interested in that subject? Well, maybe you are not interested personally, but think about who would be interested. The federal government, absolutely. How about the state government? Local governments, perhaps the EPA. They want to know what's going on with the environmental situation around there. Is this a safe plant? Maybe you need to file something internationally as well because, well, we want to make sure that we are not enriching plutonium and building weapons. All right, so these reports are made for all sorts of people. But if we were just talking about one particular part of this, for example, I ordered 5 valves, but only 4 showed up. I need to write to my supervisor and let him know that only 4 valves showed up. That is probably not interesting to everybody in the entire world. It's only interesting to the people who are building the plant at the time. So the one big report that's going to go out worldwide, possibly, that's a formal report. The one about the valves, hey, I need another valve, that's an informal report. How do you write these things then? Let's talk about it. Informal reports can be fill-in-the-blank sheets, as we mentioned. They could also be semi-unstructured. So it could be just a blank sheet that you start writing in. That doesn't mean that you can just write whatever you want. There's probably an expectation of how you'd go about doing it. Good informal reports are going to follow simple and repetitive internal patterns. They are not going to be random. They are not going to surprise their reader. Surprises generally in technical documents are bad. You want to make sure that you lead your audience through easily so they can understand what is coming and not be surprised by any weird stuff. So you're going to follow that simple and repetitive internal pattern. And in particular, we follow simple and repetitive internal patterns when we talk about progress and status reports. So let's talk about doing that. We're going to talk about structure, organization, and schedules, and visual representations. So when you structure a progress or status report, you're going to follow a basic structure. Introduction, body, and conclusion. And you've probably heard this advice before. It's not really a big deal. But here's the deal. The specific contents that you put in these things are going to depend on the report's purpose. Let's focus on explaining how this works. So with the introduction, body, and conclusion, we're going to ignore the body for just a moment and focus on the introduction and conclusion. We will come back to the body. For the introduction, you want to describe what is your purpose for writing? What is coming up next in the report body's contents? You've probably seen that sort of idea before, right? That first one-sentence paragraph containing a purpose statement of a memo, that's the same thing we're talking about here. Then in the conclusion, summarize the contents and make sure you follow the report's purpose. It's quite unfortunate that many times students in particular will start writing an informal report and they forget what they're saying halfway through and they end up way over in left field. Stay focused on what it is you're talking about. So echo your purpose statement, follow it all the way through, and make sure you actually do what you promised to do. Then, let's talk about the body. For a progress or status report, use one of these 2 patterns. Use a time pattern or use a task pattern. Here's the deal. A time pattern is just a chronological list of first, here's what happened, second, what's happened, here's third, what happened. A task pattern, on the other hand, breaks down the project into different tasks. It doesn't matter necessarily when they happened, it's that they happened at all. You can discuss these tasks in any logical order you want to. If you want to discuss them chronologically, that's fine. But if you want to talk about, for example, Dave over here on the project is doing this, while Marcia is doing this other thing, and you want to talk about them separately, and despite that you would have to go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth if you're talking about chronologically, that wouldn't make any sense, it would be confusing. So break it apart however you like in a task pattern. Let's talk schedules. One of these things you want to include in a progress report is your schedule. Always, always, always. Tell the reader what happened, what's going to happen, what are your milestones, how do you know you're on track? Speaking of on track, are you ahead of schedule? Are you behind schedule? If you are behind schedule, what is your plan for catching up? The thing is, you need to be honest. If you lie and say, yeah, everything's just absolutely fantastic, and things don't happen on schedule and the product doesn't ship, this is what happens, and you are at the very base of that. So avoid it. Tell the truth. If there's a problem, figure out how you're going to solve it. Include that idea in your schedule. When you're providing a schedule for an informal report, it's a good idea to include a Gantt chart. They show what is happening and when. Here's an example of one. So what we have at the left, we've got the various tasks that are going on. Then on the right, we have a list of dates. So this project is going over, this is week 6 and week 7 of the project. Starting, we see the 5th of the month going through the 18th. We've got that line there, notice the beginning and end. So on this particular task that I've highlighted, it's beginning on the 11th and ending on the 12th. Inside this thing, it's got a little different colored bar that tells us how far are we along. So for example, what if today is the 11th? You look at the Gantt chart and you say, okay, this particular box, we are exactly on schedule for this. What if today is the 12th? You look at it and say, we are behind schedule. What if today is the 10th? We look at it and say, oh, look, it was scheduled not to start yet, but we've already started and we are ahead of schedule. So this is how it all works. So the Gantt chart works this way. It's a very, very good idea to include one of these things in your progress reports. To summarize and wrap things up, for an informal progress and status report, you always want to set the scene, what's going on, purpose statement, organize the body of your report to a time or task pattern, let your reader know what's going on, discuss the schedule. Are you on schedule, behind schedule, ahead of schedule? How is it working? Write a relevant conclusion that wraps things up and lets your reader know in summary what happens, and then break up the contents logically. So if it makes sense to talk about it chronologically, do so. If it makes more sense to talk about it in terms of task A, task B, task C, do so. If it makes sense to combine them, do so. Point is, break it up logically and consider using headings when you write your contents. That is the video lecture about informal reports. Thank you for listening.